What would you do if the most powerful man in the United Kingdom, the king himself, was racing against time, against his own failing body, and against a plan he never wanted to be part of? Imagine being forced to make the ultimate decision, not in the privacy of your own home, but on the world stage, with every eye watching, every whisper amplified, and every mistake immortalized. This was the exact nightmare that gripped King Charles in the days leading up to his birthday. A day that was supposed to celebrate his life, his legacy, his reign, but instead became the countdown to a coronation that he never intended to authorize so soon. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The palace was in chaos. In the quiet corridors of Buckingham Palace, the air was thick with tension, almost palpable, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Courtiers whispered behind closed doors, the faint hum of voices carrying secrets that could topple centuries of tradition. And in the heart of it all, Charles sat alone in his study, the weight of the crown pressing heavier than it ever had, not on his head, but on his soul. A single folder lay on the mahogany desk before him, its contents sealed with the kind of official stamp that demanded obedience. But inside were truths Charles was not ready to confront. Not yet, not in front of anyone. Did you know that a monarch's birthday is supposed to be a celebration of life and service? Yet for Charles, it had become a ticking clock. Every glance at the calendar, every footstep echoing in the halls, reminded him that time was slipping, faster than he could control. Doctors had given him warnings, subtle at first, and then increasingly urgent. Some would say it was precaution, but Charles knew the truth. His body was betraying him, and the most feared betrayal of all wasn't even physical. It was the sudden, mounting pressure to crown the next generation ahead of schedule. This was not a scenario any king ever wants to face. The idea of abdication, or even partial relinquishment of duties, is often romanticized in history books. We read about it as a dignified, pre-planned transition. But when it's forced on you unexpectedly, when the courtiers, the advisors, and the government quietly conspire to push you out for your own good, it becomes terrifying. Charles felt cornered, as though the monarchy itself had turned on him, insisting that William and Catherine step into roles they might not yet be ready to handle. And the kicker? They had no idea how urgent it was. Think about it. How would you react if your successor was being thrust into power not because the throne demanded it, but because everyone else decided you were too weak, too frail, too unpredictable to remain at the helm? This is where the drama escalates. It's not just about crowns or scepters. It's about legacies, hidden agendas, personal fears, and family dynamics that could implode in a single misstep. Every action Charles took, every pause, every word, was scrutinized, analyzed, dissected, not just by the palace staff, but by the public, by media outlets around the globe, by nations waiting for stability in a fragile monarchy. Inside the palace, the tension was unlike anything in recent memory. Charles had always been the composed figure, measured, thoughtful, a monarch shaped by decades of service. Yet now, his hands trembled slightly over the folder. The first pages contained medical assessments, the sort that would make anyone's stomach churn. But Charles had seen many reports before, many warnings. What set this apart was the recommendation from his most trusted advisors. The coronation of William and Catherine should occur immediately, not in a few years, not after careful preparation, but now, coinciding with his birthday. It was supposed to be symbolic, yes, but also a humiliating reminder of his own mortality. He wasn't ready to let go, not publicly, not ceremonially. And yet, there it was, a plan he could not stop. And this is where the human element comes crashing in. You see, the public rarely sees the vulnerabilities of a king. They see the crown, the grandeur, the pomp and ceremony. They do not see the fear in his eyes as he contemplates stepping aside while his body still clings to life. They do not hear the quiet sobs of a monarch who has served his country faithfully, only to feel that his control over the institution he nurtured is slipping. And you, watching this unfold, might wonder, how would you balance duty with desire, love with fear, tradition with necessity? Charles's inner turmoil wasn't just personal. It was deeply familial. William, the heir, had always been prepared to take on responsibility in measured doses, under normal circumstances. But this wasn't normal. William and Catherine had no idea they were being rushed into history, forced to make decisions, accept titles, and take oaths under pressure that should have been ceremonial rather than coercive. And while Charles grappled with his own fears, he was acutely aware that any hesitation, any misstep, could fracture the monarchy. Could you imagine the conversations behind closed doors, the arguments, the secret meetings that could decide the future of an entire nation in mere hours? Now, let's pause for a moment. Picture this scene. Charles sitting in a dimly lit room, sunlight filtering through heavy curtains, the weight of tradition pressing down, his own mortality pressing in, and a folder in front of him containing decisions he never wanted to face. Outside, the palace is alive with movement. Aides bustling, courtiers whispering, the security detail scanning for the slightest anomaly. Somewhere in the distance, the royal guard's boots echo ominously against the marble floors. Every tick of the clock feels amplified. Every breath is measured. And somewhere, William and Catherine, completely unaware of the gravity of the moment, are being summoned for a conversation that will change their lives forever. You might be asking yourself, what was in that folder? What could be so urgent that a king would feel cornered, forced to act against his instincts? The first pages detailed the medical reports, the prognosis that Charles had long suspected but never openly acknowledged. But buried beneath the clinical jargon were notes, recommendations, timelines. Timelines that dictated exactly when William and Catherine should assume full ceremonial duties, as though life itself had a deadline stamped upon it. And suddenly, a birthday that should have celebrated the man was transformed into a countdown clock, marking the acceleration of a plan he had hoped to control in his own time. The palace atmosphere, for those who have glimpsed it behind the velvet ropes, is usually one of composed calm, of tradition upheld without a visible tremor. But in these moments, it felt different. The walls themselves seemed to bear witness to an unraveling. The whispers of staff conveyed fear and loyalty, panic and hope, all tangled together. And Charles knew that any sign of weakness could be exploited, not just by the press, but by those closest to him. The thought alone made his heart pound. Could he trust those around him? Could he trust William and Catherine to make the right choices without being blindsided by this sudden acceleration? And what about the public? Can you imagine the headlines? The splintered narratives already circulating. King forced to abdicate early. William and Catherine crowned prematurely. Palace in crisis. In the digital age, there's no room for nuance. Every tweet, every story, every analysis becomes an immediate pressure. The monarchy isn't just about tradition. It's about perception, about confidence, about the image of stability projected to millions. Charles had to consider all of it in his fragile state, with advisors whispering conflicting advice and medical staff warning against emotional strain. And yet, despite the looming pressure, Charles was not completely powerless. He still had influence. He could shape the narrative, control the ceremony, even inject personal messages for William and Catherine. But the clock was ticking. Every moment wasted, every pause considered, was another opportunity for missteps, for leaks, for a perception that the monarchy was faltering. And as you sit there, watching this unfold, the question remains, what would you do if you were in his place? Would you cling to power until the very last moment, or would you bow gracefully, even when unprepared? But as Charles contemplated these impossible choices, he heard footsteps approaching the study. The faint rustle of fabric, the soft click of polished shoes. His heart quickened. Was it William? Catherine? An advisor bearing another folder, another ultimatum? Every scenario played in his mind like a series of rapid-fire images, a cinematic montage of regret, pride, fear, and duty. And then, just before the door opened, Charles realized the horrifying truth. The folder in front of him wasn't the only decision to be made. Someone else held the key to the next step. A secret, a revelation, a piece of information that could change everything in the blink of an eye. And that is where we leave our king, sitting on the precipice of history, aware that the day meant to celebrate him would instead become the day the crown shifted earlier than anyone expected. The palace held its collective breath, the kingdom waited unknowingly, and a monarch wrestled with mortality, power, and family loyalty. And the question that haunts us all, When the crown is forced into the hands of the next generation, can tradition survive the pressure? Or will the secrets, the fears, and the human emotions beneath the golden facade rewrite history forever? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if a single document could change the course of a monarchy? A paper so consequential that it could turn a king's world upside down before the day was even over? That's exactly what happened in Buckingham Palace, in the quiet, heavily guarded study of King Charles, when a folder, small, unassuming, yet terrifying, was delivered to his desk. The air felt thicker than usual, the sunlight outside muted as if even nature sensed the gravity of what was inside. Charles had always understood the weight of the crown, the invisible pressures that came with every handshake, every nod, every wave to the public. But nothing in his years of service had prepared him for what this folder contained: a cold, unflinching outline of a future he had never wanted, and a timetable for action that made his stomach churn with dread. The document was from the Royal Medical Team, the very individuals he trusted to safeguard his health and, indirectly, the stability of the monarchy itself. Normally, medical reports were mundane, filled with cautious advice, perhaps a note about diet, exercise, or the occasional procedure. But this one was different. The first pages detailed his condition with clinical precision, yet beneath the sterile language was a truth that made Charles's hands tremble as he read. The prognosis was far graver than he had feared, and yet, even as he absorbed the words, the report didn't stop there. It went on to outline an accelerated succession plan, suggesting that William and Catherine be formally crowned earlier than tradition dictated, ideally timed with Charles's upcoming birthday. A symbolic gesture, yes, but also a stark reminder of his own vulnerability. Could the monarchy truly be so cold, so precise, as to dictate when a king's heir should step into power, based not on readiness, but on the urgency of mortality? Charles felt the weight of every precedent, every rule, every history book that chronicled the lives of those who had worn the crown before him. And yet, here he was, confronted with a stark ultimatum dressed as advice. Act now, or risk destabilizing centuries of tradition. The room seemed to shrink around him. Each footstep in the corridor, each distant murmur of palace staff, felt amplified, as though the walls themselves were listening, judging. He could almost hear the whisper of past monarchs, warning, advising, condemning. The document also included detailed recommendations from advisors outside the medical team, men and women whose loyalty to the crown was unquestioned, but whose understanding of human frailty was less precise. They outlined potential scenarios in which Charles's health could deteriorate unexpectedly, where delays in the coronation might cause political tension, unrest, or, he shuddered to think, public speculation that could shake the very foundation of the monarchy. Their words were diplomatic, professional, yet merciless. Every paragraph was a gentle nudge, a reminder that the weight of leadership extended beyond life itself. It was not just a medical report, it was a blueprint for the acceleration of history. Charles leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, trying to process the magnitude of what lay before him. He had served his country faithfully, guided by principle, experience, and a desire to do right by the nation. Yet this folder suggested that his ability to dictate the future was slipping, that his body, his advisors, even time itself were forcing him into decisions he wasn't ready to make. And then, a chilling thought struck him. What if the public knew? What if the world knew that their king, once so composed, so steady, was being forced into a premature transition? The notion was almost unbearable. He had envisioned a graceful reign, a dignified transfer of power. Now, the narrative was being written without his consent. Meanwhile, across the palace, staff were acutely aware of the mounting tension. Courtiers moved silently, exchanging nervous glances. Even the royal guards, trained to remain stoic in all situations, seemed to carry an undercurrent of anticipation. It was rare for the monarchy to show such vulnerability. Rare, but not impossible. Rumors had begun to circulate among the staff, subtle, careful observations of Charles's health, whispers of long nights spent alone, of meals skipped, of unusual fatigue. None of these had leaked to the public yet, but in the age of instant media, every observation carried the potential for catastrophe. And in the heart of it all, Charles wrestled with the document before him, each word a hammer striking the fragile foundation of his composure. The next section of the report revealed another layer of complexity, the timeline itself. William and Catherine were not to be merely observed or groomed quietly in the wings. They were to be prepared to step into full ceremonial roles immediately. Every detail, from public appearances to private counsel, was meticulously scheduled. The report outlined rehearsals, media briefings, ceremonial protocols, even seating arrangements in anticipation of their sudden prominence. It was as if someone had attempted to compress decades of preparation into mere days. The implication was clear. There was no room for hesitation, no margin for error, and no choice left for Charles beyond acquiescence. He was being cornered, and even as a king, the power of the document pressed upon him like a physical weight. Charles's mind raced as he considered the consequences. How would William react? Would he feel ready or resentful? And Catherine? Would she understand the gravity of what was being thrust upon them? The family dynamics, always delicate, were suddenly amplified by urgency. He knew that every conversation, every glance, every word exchanged between them could alter the course of their relationships. Yet there was no time for lengthy discussions, no room for subtlety. History demanded action, and the king, despite decades of leadership, felt the sting of impotence. He was being forced into a sequence of events that even his imagination had not prepared him for. In a sudden moment, Charles considered the press. If this premature coronation became public knowledge, how would the nation react? How would the Commonwealth, the world, perceive this accelerated transition? The monarchy had always relied on perception, orderly, dignified, and unassailable. But now, the carefully constructed image of stability was at risk. One leak, one misstep, one word taken out of context could ignite speculation, scandal, even unrest. The very institution he had dedicated his life to protecting could crumble, not because of external enemies, but because of a medical report and a council's recommendation. The irony was bitter. He had spent a lifetime understanding the optics of monarchy, and now, in the face of mortality and familial duty, the optics threatened to consume him. Charles's fingers hovered over the folder, trembling slightly. He had faced crises before, both political and personal, but none had carried the intimacy of this kind of fear. None had required him to confront not just what he must do, but what history would write about him. Could he let go gracefully? Could he maintain dignity while watching the future unfold without full control? These questions haunted him, looping endlessly, unanswered. And in that quiet, tension-filled moment, he realized that this report had shattered more than his plans. It had shattered his certainty, his confidence, his sense of agency. He was a king, yes, but he was also a man facing the undeniable truth of his own vulnerability. The palace remained silent, almost reverent, as Charles wrestled with his thoughts. Each tick of the clock seemed amplified, each breath a reminder of fleeting time. He reviewed the recommendations once more, reading the meticulous instructions, the suggestions, the carefully constructed argument for early succession. And then he paused on a single sentence, one line that made his chest tighten. It is imperative that the crown is passed in a manner that ensures continuity, stability, and public confidence. The words were clinical, yet brutal in their implication. Continuity, stability, public confidence. They all demanded action, even if his body and heart screamed otherwise. And just as Charles absorbed this realization, a subtle sound echoed down the corridor. A knock, gentle but insistent. His heart leapt. Who could it be at this critical moment? An advisor with further instructions? A doctor with new updates? Or perhaps William or Catherine themselves, arriving unaware of the full gravity of the moment? The knock reverberated in his mind like a drumbeat, a warning that the next steps were unavoidable. He was not alone in the decision, yet he was profoundly solitary in the responsibility. One moment, and the course of history could shift irreversibly. And that's where the chapter ends, with Charles staring at the door, the folder still before him, every muscle tense, every thought racing. Outside, footsteps approach, carrying news, pressure, and the unknown. And in that instant, Charles realizes that whatever comes through that door may force him to act sooner than ever imagined. The monarchy, the family, the world, all are waiting, unknowingly, for a decision that could not be delayed. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. Imagine being summoned to a private room in the heart of Buckingham Palace, not for a ceremony, not for a celebration, but for a conversation that could irrevocably alter your life. That was William's reality that morning. He had always been the dutiful heir, prepared for decades to eventually inherit the crown, yet the timing of this summons was not part of any plan he had envisioned. There was urgency in the call, a tension in the air, something almost unspeakable lurking behind the polished doors. And as he approached the study, a sense of foreboding coiled tightly in his stomach. What could be so pressing that his father, King Charles himself, had personally summoned him? When the door opened, William was struck immediately by the atmosphere. The room was dim, the curtains drawn, sunlight diffused into a golden haze that made the dust in the air visible. Charles sat behind his desk, eyes tired but sharp, the folder from the medical team still lying open before him. There was a weight in the air that was almost tangible, as if the walls themselves pressed down with expectation. William's steps faltered momentarily. In that instant, he realized this was no ordinary father-son conversation. This was history unfolding. And in history's shadow, decisions would have to be made. Charles spoke first, his voice calm, but carrying a tremor of urgency. "William," he began, "there are things you need to know. Things that cannot wait." William nodded, heart pounding. He had a feeling he already knew what was coming, yet the reality of the moment struck him like a physical blow. His mind raced. Could it really be? Was the coronation being moved up? Was this entire timeline real, or was he imagining it, caught in a cruel twist of fate? He tried to steady himself, tried to keep his voice level, yet inside, chaos raged. This wasn't preparation. It was a summons to act, to respond, to make choices before he felt ready. As Charles detailed the contents of the medical report and the subsequent recommendation, William's initial reaction was disbelief. "Dad, you're serious?" he asked, voice tight with incredulity. Every fiber of him wanted to push back, to deny it, to claim that tradition, preparation, and prudence should prevail. The idea that he and Catherine could be thrust into full ceremonial roles, ahead of schedule, made his stomach churn. The concept of early succession wasn't just unconventional, it felt wrong. How could they, he wondered, shoulder the responsibilities of a kingdom when the timing itself was dictated by circumstance rather than choice? Yet, even as he processed these thoughts, he understood the severity of his father's situation. Charles's health, the subtle but relentless decline, was undeniable. William's sense of duty collided violently with his instinct to protect, to delay, to maintain normalcy. And then there was Catherine. William knew that her perspective mattered immensely. She had always been his anchor, the voice of reason, the one who could see beyond the pomp to the people, to the family, to the heart of what was truly necessary. Yet, the thought of telling her, of including her in a decision that should have unfolded gradually, was daunting. How could he explain that history demanded action not from ambition, but from urgency? How could he convey the terrifying responsibility of being thrust forward into the spotlight, knowing every move would be scrutinized, every error magnified, every hesitation judged? The very idea felt overwhelming, almost cruel. As the discussion continued, William found himself grappling with a mix of emotions: shock, fear, disbelief, and an undercurrent of guilt. Guilt because he felt powerless to change the course of events, even though he was the heir. Fear because the responsibilities now resting on his shoulders seemed immense, almost unmanageable. Shock because the accelerated timeline violated every expectation he had grown up with. And yet, amidst the storm of emotion, a strange clarity emerged. He could not ignore his father's reality. He could not pretend the reports, the recommendations, the pressure from the advisors were inconsequential. History, it seemed, had made its decision, and William was left to navigate its consequences. Questions spiraled in his mind. How would the public respond? Would they perceive him as ready, as capable, as composed? Or would they see hesitation, indecision, uncertainty? The weight of the monarchy pressed down on him with suffocating force. Every step he took, every word he spoke, would be a reflection not only of himself, but of his father, of Catherine, and of the centuries-old institution they were now being asked to uphold prematurely. Could he embody the stability, the wisdom, and the leadership demanded of a monarch, even while still coming to terms with the sudden acceleration of his destiny? William's thoughts turned inward, to family. How would the children react? George, Charlotte, and Louis were young, innocent, and yet, in ways he had never imagined, already affected by the gravity of the monarchy's demands. He imagined Catherine explaining the sudden change in protocol to them, the weight of history pressing down even on their small shoulders. The thought tightened his chest. Could he shield them from this? Could he explain the urgency without instilling fear? And, above all, could he maintain the integrity of the monarchy while also protecting the personal, human elements of his family life? These questions had no easy answers. The conversation shifted subtly as Charles, sensing William's turmoil, emphasized the gravity of the moment. "This is not about ambition," Charles said, voice calm but firm. "This is about continuity, stability, and the future of the monarchy. You must be ready, even if the timing is not what you would choose." William nodded, swallowing hard, the enormity of the words sinking in. The balance between duty and personal readiness felt impossible to maintain. He was being asked to step into history before he was fully prepared, to carry a responsibility that had been decades in the making, yet compressed into days. The psychological weight of the request was immense, and William felt the pressure mounting with each passing second. But alongside the weight of duty, a spark of resolve emerged. William knew he could not shy away. He had trained for moments like this, even if not under such sudden and extreme circumstances. The monarchy depended on his composure, his decisiveness, and his ability to navigate the delicate intersection of tradition and necessity. The path forward was fraught with uncertainty, yet retreat was not an option. Every hesitation could have consequences far beyond personal discomfort. Every misstep could destabilize the institution, affect the family, and alter the perception of the monarchy worldwide. As the discussion drew to a close, William realized that he faced an impossible choice: honor tradition and delay, risking instability and potential scrutiny, or embrace the accelerated timeline, shouldering responsibilities he had only just imagined. The tension in the room was electric. Charles, weary yet resolute, watched his son struggle with the weight of destiny. William's mind raced. Could he reconcile personal readiness with public expectation? Could he protect his family while simultaneously stepping fully into history? Every possible decision seemed fraught with peril. The room felt charged with anticipation, a crucible in which history itself would be forged. Then, just as William thought he might finally gather his thoughts, the sound of the study door creaking open interrupted the tension. Catherine stepped in, calm yet perceptive, her presence commanding yet empathetic. William looked at her, the enormity of the moment reflected in both their eyes. He realized that whatever decision he made, they would face it together. Yet there was still one unknown element. Something in Catherine's expression hinted at information he had not yet received, a piece of the puzzle that might tip the balance. The weight of urgency pressed even harder, and for a moment, William felt a pang of dread unlike anything he had experienced before. And that's where the chapter leaves us, with William caught between disbelief, fear, and duty, staring at Catherine as the room's tension reaches its peak. The decision that will shape the monarchy hangs in the balance, poised on the knife edge between personal readiness and historical necessity. The heir is ready to step forward, but the full truth, the final piece of what Catherine holds, is yet to be revealed. What she says next could change everything. But what comes next will shock William, the monarchy, and the world. Imagine walking into a room expecting routine discussion, yet the moment your eyes fall on a single, unassuming envelope, you realize your life is about to pivot in ways you never imagined. That's exactly what happened to Catherine that morning. The golden light filtering through Buckingham Palace's grand windows caught on the envelope's seal, making it gleam with almost foreboding intensity. It was addressed solely to her, in a hand that was precise yet unidentifiable, as if the sender wanted to create mystery, urgency, and weight all at once. Catherine's instincts told her instantly, this wasn't ceremonial. This wasn't a simple update from the palace. This was something far more consequential. A message that would force her, and everyone she loved, to step into a reality they weren't prepared for. As she reached for the envelope, her fingers trembled, not with fear of the contents alone, but with the knowledge that what she was about to read could reshape the course of the monarchy. Catherine had always approached her royal duties with grace, poise, and measured discretion. But even for her, the pressure she felt in that moment was almost suffocating. The room felt smaller, charged with a tension that made the air thick and every breath deliberate. Charles, seated behind his desk, looked at her expectantly, while William, still reeling from the morning's revelations, watched with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. All three of them understood, in that unspoken moment, that the envelope was not merely a message, it was a decision point, a hinge upon which the future would turn. She hesitated before opening it. What could be inside? Perhaps a legal directive? Perhaps a detailed schedule for the premature coronation? Perhaps something even more personal, something intended to test her resolve, her judgment, her loyalty? Catherine's mind raced. She could hear the quiet murmurs of the palace staff outside, the faint echo of footsteps on the marble floors, and she imagined the eyes of the nation, millions of people expecting calm and stability, even as history quietly shifted behind the velvet curtains. And in that moment, she realized the magnitude of the responsibility she was about to inherit. She wasn't just a consort, a supportive presence beside the heir. She was now a crucial player in the timing and execution of a crown being passed ahead of schedule. The envelope's contents were both shocking and strategic. Inside, Catherine found detailed recommendations for the accelerated succession plan. They were specific. Precise timings, exact protocols, ceremonial instructions, even directives about public messaging. This wasn't merely advisory, it was directive. Someone had prepared for every possible scenario, anticipated every contingency, and created a blueprint that left almost no room for deviation. And yet, embedded within the bureaucratic language were subtle implications that struck Catherine with emotional force. The plan assumed she and William would comply without question, that they would put the demands of the monarchy above personal readiness, above family, above hesitation. The weight of expectation, carefully masked under the guise of duty, landed squarely on her shoulders. Catherine paused to absorb what she had read. The accelerated timeline wasn't just a minor adjustment, it was monumental. The coronation, traditionally spaced to allow preparation, education, and reflection, was now being compressed into a matter of days, aligned with Charles's birthday. The symbolism was glaring. A celebration of the king's life had been converted into a countdown, a subtle but undeniable signal that Charles's authority was waning, that the monarchy demanded continuity regardless of personal readiness. Catherine's heart sank as she realized that the birthday, once a joyful occasion, had been transformed into a platform of urgency, a stage on which she and William were now expected to perform. And yet, amidst the shock, Catherine's mind shifted to strategy. She was not a passive observer. She had navigated crises before, had mediated family conflicts, had balanced public perception with private reality, and she knew instinctively that this moment required both poise and decisiveness. She began mentally rehearsing the conversations she would have with William, with Charles, with senior advisors. How could she ensure that they honored the accelerated plan without jeopardizing stability? How could she manage the optics, protect the children, and maintain the dignity of the monarchy, all while grappling with the personal shock of the moment? The pressure was immense, almost unbearable, but Catherine's determination, her composure, her strategic mind, all came to the forefront. She glanced at Charles. His eyes, usually so composed, carried a subtle tension she had rarely seen. There was a vulnerability there, a recognition that even as king, he was constrained by circumstance, by time, by health, and by the demands of history itself. And Catherine realized that the envelope was more than a set of instructions. It was a lifeline. It offered guidance, clarity, and direction, yet it also demanded courage, judgment, and decisiveness. The burden, though heavy, was now partly hers to bear. She felt a mix of fear and resolve, the duality of human reaction in the face of monumental responsibility. Catherine's thoughts turned briefly to William. She knew he was still processing the shock of his father's revelation, still grappling with disbelief, fear, and an overwhelming sense of duty. She approached him quietly, careful not to startle, and laid the envelope before him. His eyes flicked to it, and for a moment, neither spoke. Words were unnecessary. The gravity of the situation filled the room. William understood immediately that this was not just another directive, another ceremonial schedule. This was history being thrust upon them, a challenge that would test their character, judgment, and resilience in ways they had never anticipated. The dynamics of the moment were profound. Catherine felt the dual responsibility of supporting William while also asserting her own agency. The monarchy had always relied on tradition, on predictability, on continuity, but now, in the compressed, urgent timeline dictated by Charles's health and the recommendations of advisors, they were required to act swiftly, decisively, and in unison. Every decision mattered. Every hesitation could have ramifications. The envelope had turned the ordinary rhythms of royal life into a crucible of history, and Catherine was acutely aware that their actions in the coming hours would be dissected, analyzed, and remembered forever. And yet, even as the reality of the envelope's contents sank in, Catherine's strategic mind noted subtleties others might have missed: timing cues, symbolic gestures, phrasing, and the potential for misinterpretation. She realized that the accelerated coronation was not just about duty. It was about optics, perception, and the delicate art of managing both personal and public consequences. One wrong move, one misstep, could destabilize not only their family but the perception of the monarchy itself. The tension in the room was electric, almost unbearable, as the weight of expectation pressed down upon them all. Finally, Catherine spoke, her voice steady yet carrying the weight of the moment. "William, this is bigger than either of us anticipated. We have to think carefully about every step." Her words were calm, measured, but underneath lay an urgency that could not be ignored. William nodded, the realization dawning that history was no longer something distant or theoretical. It was here, immediate, and demanding action. And as they both contemplated the next steps, Catherine sensed an undercurrent she could not yet name. Something in the envelope hinted at a secret, a revelation that Charles had not yet shared, a piece of information that could shift the balance in unpredictable ways. The chapter closes with Catherine looking at the folder, William by her side, and Charles watching silently. The stakes are clear: the accelerated coronation, the compressed timeline, the fragile health of the king, all converge into a moment of unprecedented tension. And just as Catherine begins to consider her next move, a subtle sound, footsteps, a rustle, the faint click of a door, signals that the next piece of the puzzle is arriving. Whatever comes through that door could alter everything, leaving the family, the monarchy, and the world to grapple with consequences that none of them could fully anticipate. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The grand hall of Buckingham Palace was quieter than usual that morning, but the tension in the air was palpable. Outside, the sunlight glinted off polished floors and golden fixtures, masking the storm brewing inside. For decades, the council chambers had been a place of deliberation, diplomacy, and decorum, but today it would bear witness to a different kind of drama. Today, secrets would surface, loyalties would be tested, and the very foundation of the monarchy would tremble beneath the weight of decisions that could no longer wait. King Charles, fragile yet resolute, had summoned the Privy Council under the guise of an urgent, but discreet, session. What was meant to be procedural was about to become a crucible of fear, ambition, and inevitability. The members arrived one by one, their faces a mask of practiced neutrality, betraying nothing of the turmoil that rippled through the palace. Advisors who had spent decades ensuring the stability of the crown now faced a new, pressing reality. The king's health was precarious, his time uncertain, and the succession demanded action faster than tradition had ever anticipated. Whispers had already begun among the aides and staff. Some speculated that Charles's fatigue was worse than previously disclosed, others that the birthday coronation had been deliberately accelerated to cement continuity before rumors of illness could spread. The combination of fear and speculation hung thickly in the room, wrapping around every whispered word, every measured glance. Charles entered last, moving carefully, the weight of the crown unseen but present in every gesture, in every faltering step. There was a quiet gravity to his entrance that silenced the chamber. Members of the council bowed subtly, acknowledging the authority of the monarch even as their own anxieties tightened around them. Charles took his place at the head of the table, eyes scanning the assembled faces, noting expressions of concern, hesitation, and hidden agendas. For a moment, it seemed as if time itself paused. He was not merely a man confronting mortality. He was a king standing on the edge of history, forced to make choices that would ripple far beyond the gilded walls around him. The meeting began with formalities, as expected. Reports were read, procedural updates noted, and the usual cadence of diplomacy set the stage. Yet beneath the veneer of tradition, an undercurrent of urgency ran like electricity through the room. Charles's health, he knew, was not merely a private matter. It had implications for the stability of the nation, the perception of continuity, and the confidence of allies around the world. Each sentence he spoke was measured, deliberate, yet carried with it the unspoken weight of an ultimatum: act or risk instability. Then the conversation shifted. One senior advisor, a figure whose loyalty to the monarchy was unquestioned but whose reputation for blunt counsel preceded him, spoke up. He laid out the accelerated coronation plan, emphasizing the risks of delay and framing the argument in stark, almost clinical terms. "Your Majesty," he said, "continuity must be guaranteed. Every day that passes without clear succession increases the risk of speculation, uncertainty, and public concern. William and Catherine are ready. The nation requires certainty, and time is not on our side." The word struck Charles like a physical blow. Ready? Ready? Was it truly possible for them to be ready? The king's mind raced, considering every nuance. William's experience, Catherine's poise, the children's understanding of events, the political landscape, the international implications. And yet, the room around him remained calm, composed, as if the plan had always been inevitable. The calculated certainty of the advisors, their insistence on immediacy, pressed against him like a tide he could not resist. William, seated nearby, felt the tension escalate. He had expected counsel, advice, perhaps a discussion of possibilities, but not this sense of inexorable compulsion. He glanced at Catherine, who sat upright, her fingers lightly resting on the envelope from earlier, a silent reminder that decisions were no longer theoretical. They were urgent, concrete, unavoidable. Every instinct told him to resist, to ask for more time, to assert readiness rather than compliance. Yet he could see the quiet determination in his father's eyes. There was no room for debate. The council's authority and Charles's vulnerability had fused into an almost unyielding force. Arguments began to surface, subtle but charged with tension. Some council members expressed concern about the optics of rushing the coronation. Others highlighted the historical precedent. Had any monarch been forced into early succession under such circumstances? The answer, unsurprisingly, was no. This was uncharted territory, unprecedented in modern history. And yet, there was a strange unanimity in the recommendation: act immediately for the stability of the monarchy. Charles felt a chill at the thought. Tradition, that long-standing foundation of legitimacy, was being overruled by urgency, by circumstance, by the relentless march of time. And then came the darkest moment of the meeting. One member, cautious at first, then emboldened by the collective nods of others, proposed something shocking: aligning the coronation with Charles's birthday. The rationale was simple, strategic. The symbolism would be undeniable, the public narrative controlled, the continuity undeniable. But for Charles, the symbolism was a knife in the heart. His birthday, a day of celebration, remembrance, and personal reflection, had been converted into a stage for inevitability, a public demonstration that the crown was being passed, whether he wished it or not. His heart tightened, chest heavy, as the weight of the suggestion pressed down on him. Was this really how he would be remembered? Not as a king of wisdom, experience, and service, but as a man forced aside by circumstance? William and Catherine shared a fleeting glance. Neither spoke, yet the unspoken understanding between them was profound. This was bigger than tradition, bigger than duty, bigger than any personal hesitation. The monarchy, the family, and the nation were entwined in a crucible of urgency. Every move would be scrutinized, every gesture amplified. Even as they sat quietly, the pressure mounted, a silent, almost suffocating force that reminded them how fragile the balance of history truly was. Charles tried to speak, to interject, to push back, but his voice felt heavy, constrained by both physical fatigue and the inevitability of the council's momentum. Words faltered, hesitation lingered, and the council sensed his vulnerability. Yet, in that vulnerability lay power. The final choice, ultimately, remained his. But even with agency, the moral and emotional burden was immense. Could he truly dictate the pace of history while facing his own mortality? Could he reconcile personal readiness with the demands of the institution? Every instinct screamed caution, but the room pressed forward, an unstoppable tide of expectation, precedent, and urgency. And then the unexpected occurred. One junior advisor, relatively unknown yet sharp, voiced a warning that rippled through the chamber like a shockwave. "Your Majesty," she said cautiously, "delaying may seem prudent personally, but every hour increases the risk that public confidence erodes. The world will not wait for readiness. It will respond to perception. We must act before rumors take hold." The words, though measured, struck with brutal clarity. Public confidence, history, legacy, perception, all were being used as levers to force action. Charles felt the walls close in, the centuries of expectation pressing down. The future of the monarchy inextricably linked to decisions he was being compelled to make under duress. By the end of the meeting, Charles was exhausted. Not just physically, but emotionally. The council had laid bare the stakes, the risks, the symbolic urgency. Every argument, every recommendation burdened with knowledge, their own agency complicated by the inexorable pace of events. And outside, the palace itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what was to come. Nations pressing down. Outside, unseen, the world waits, unaware that the monarchy is teetering on the edge of history, and that the birthday which should have been celebration is now a deadline, a catalyst, a moment of reckoning. And just as he contemplates the next steps, a subtle sound, a soft footfall, a whisper, the rustle of papers, signals that the decision point has arrived, and with it, consequences none of them can yet predict. But what comes next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if a celebration meant for joy and reflection was secretly transformed into a countdown to destiny? That was the harsh reality facing King Charles, William, and Catherine as they contemplated the accelerated timeline for succession. The decision to align the coronation with Charles's birthday was not arbitrary. It was strategic, symbolic, and, in many ways, ruthless. For centuries, birthdays of monarchs have been markers of celebration, public appearances, and ceremonies, but never had they been used as an instrument of pressure, a calendar-driven push forcing heirs into history before they were prepared. For Charles, it was an uncomfortable realization. Even moments meant for personal reflection could be co-opted into the machinery of state, turning intimacy into obligation. The genesis of the birthday deadline began in the corridors of power, in private consultations between the palace strategists and senior advisors. They understood the delicate balance between tradition, public perception, and the human elements at play. Reports and memos, carefully drafted, emphasized that symbolism mattered as much as procedure. An early coronation on Charles's birthday would achieve multiple objectives. Publicly acknowledge the king's continued relevance, demonstrate stability and continuity to the nation, and, crucially, cement William and Catherine's presence in the line of succession. It was a masterstroke in optics, but also a calculated pressure point that none of the royals were truly prepared for. Charles, upon learning of this strategy, felt a familiar tightening in his chest. The idea that his birthday, once a personal marker, a private pause in decades of public duty, could be turned into a platform for an accelerated succession was almost unbearable. Every birthday had been an opportunity to reflect on his reign, to consider his contributions, his legacy, and the family he hoped to guide gently toward the future. Now, that reflection was impossible. Instead, he was being asked to orchestrate history, to condense years of preparation into a single, symbolic moment, and to do so while balancing fragile health, familial dynamics, and public scrutiny. William and Catherine were equally caught off guard. For them, birthdays were not mere dates. They were markers of life, of family, of personal milestones. The idea that one such day could be co-opted as a vehicle for premature ascension created a tension they had never imagined. William, acutely aware of the responsibilities awaiting him, wrestled with the collision between personal readiness and historical necessity. Catherine, ever poised yet internally tense, recognized that the symbolism carried weight beyond ceremony. It was a statement to the public, the Commonwealth, and even international observers that the monarchy remained strong, decisive, and unshakable, regardless of the king's personal situation. But why the birthday specifically? The symbolism was layered. To the public, it demonstrated continuity. The king, though aging and infirm, retained authority while gracefully preparing the next generation to assume leadership. To political allies, it conveyed decisiveness, signaling that the monarchy was not in disarray and that transition plans were meticulously managed. To the global stage, it framed the narrative of stability and tradition, reinforcing centuries of precedent even amidst a crisis. And yet, beneath all these calculated optics lay a deeply personal undercurrent. The king's own sense of mortality, the inevitable reality that time was slipping away, and the uncomfortable truth that the birthday he had once celebrated as personal joy was now weaponized against him in subtle, relentless ways. The decision was not without controversy. Within the palace, murmurs of dissent circulated. Some senior advisors questioned whether attaching such pressure to a birthday might backfire, creating an impression of weakness or desperation. Others argued that the symbolic act was necessary, urgent, unavoidable. The debate reflected the delicate interplay between duty, optics, and human emotion. Charles, attuned to both strategy and legacy, understood the rationale, yet felt a personal sting. A day meant to honor his life and reign had become a deadline, a ticking clock, a mechanism for acceleration. The very idea of celebrating while simultaneously orchestrating succession created tension that was almost unbearable. Catherine, reading between the lines of the strategic memos, realized the brilliance and cruelty of the plan. On one hand, it was elegant. The public would see stability, the monarchy would appear in control, and the transition could occur without scandal. On the other hand, it forced the royals into a scenario that left little room for preparation, reflection, or human consideration. The envelope she had received days prior now seemed to hum with a quiet, latent urgency. Every instruction, every timing note, every carefully phrased directive had been crafted to align with the birthday, ensuring that symbolism and action converged into a single, public moment of undeniable impact. William, listening to these details unfold, struggled to reconcile his sense of duty with personal readiness. Could he truly assume responsibilities prematurely and maintain both public composure and private equilibrium? The crown, after all, was more than a symbol. It was a living institution, entwined with national stability, family legacy, and the perception of governance. Acting too early could be seen as audacious, even reckless. Acting too late could invite speculation, criticism, and potential instability. The accelerated birthday timeline removed much of the flexibility, leaving them to act under pressure with stakes higher than they had ever encountered. Even within the palace walls, the consequences of this decision were being felt. Staff, courtiers, and aides moved with subtle caution, aware that the atmosphere was charged, that a single misstep could reverberate beyond the gilded rooms and marble floors. Conversations were whispered, eyes darted, and every gesture was measured. Charles, observing the interplay between William and Catherine, recognized the subtle tension building, a mixture of anticipation, anxiety, and determination. He understood that their reactions would shape the success of the accelerated plan, that their composure would influence the perception of the monarchy, and that the birthday, intended as a symbol of continuity, had become a crucible testing every personal and political bond. History, too, weighed heavily in Charles's mind. Monarchs before him had faced transitions, crises, and succession challenges, yet none had confronted the combination of fragile health, familial pressure, and accelerated symbolism compressed into a single day. The birthday deadline was unprecedented, audacious, and fraught with risk. Yet, strategically, it made sense. It provided clarity to the public, control over optics, and a sense of inevitability. But strategically and emotionally, it tore at the fabric of Charles's carefully cultivated sense of agency. He was being guided, nudged, and in subtle ways, compelled. Time was no longer his own. History demanded action, and the birthday deadline was the fulcrum upon which events would pivot. As Catherine reflected on the implications, she realized that beyond ceremony, the accelerated plan carried profound emotional consequences. William and she would be thrust into the spotlight not gradually, not gently, but with immediacy. Their ability to process, to prepare, and to lead in a way that felt authentic and measured would be tested to its limits. Every gesture, every smile, every public appearance would be analyzed. Every misstep would be amplified. And the birthday, once a personal celebration, now loomed as a public crucible. Catherine felt the pressure settle heavily on her shoulders, a silent reminder that leadership demanded courage, poise, and a readiness that was not yet fully formed. The chapter closes as Charles, William, and Catherine sit together in quiet reflection, aware of the enormity of the next days. The birthday is no longer just a celebration. It is a deadline, a symbol, a challenge. And just as they begin to contemplate the final steps, a faint sound echoes through the corridors. A messenger, a whisper, an unexpected arrival with information that could alter everything. The tension, now almost unbearable, signals that the next revelation is coming, one that will force decisions, reveal secrets, and redefine the family, the monarchy, and the day itself. But what comes next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The streets of London had never seemed quieter, yet never more expectant. From Buckingham Palace to the farthest reaches of the Commonwealth, a subtle tension gripped the nation, though few could articulate its source. Behind the velvet ropes and golden gates, a monarchy in crisis was unfolding. King Charles, William, and Catherine were at the epicenter, contending with a sequence of events that had compressed decades of tradition into a matter of days. The accelerated coronation, the symbolic birthday deadline, and the hidden urgency of Charles's health had turned what should have been a celebration into a tense countdown, and the world, though largely unaware, was already feeling the ripple effects. Inside the palace, every movement was measured, every gesture scrutinized. Courtiers exchanged knowing glances. Aides whispered in corners. Even the guards, trained for stoic composure, carried subtle tension in their footsteps. The atmosphere was almost electric, a mix of anxiety and anticipation that seemed to permeate the very walls. Charles, though composed outwardly, felt the pressure mounting with each passing hour. His body, already fragile, carried the weight of duty, tradition, and mortality. Every choice, every word, every pause had consequences that extended far beyond the room in which he sat. This was not just a personal challenge. It was a national moment, a global spectacle and microcosm, and history itself was waiting. William and Catherine were acutely aware of the stakes. The accelerated timeline left little room for preparation, no margin for hesitation. They were suddenly responsible for projecting stability, composure, and leadership at a level previously reserved for decades of careful grooming. The eyes of the nation, though unseen, seemed to watch from every direction, and the weight of expectation pressed down upon them like a physical force. Every decision, every glance, every public gesture could tip the balance between calm continuity and perceived chaos. Could they navigate these unprecedented pressures and maintain the image of a seamless transition? Could they step forward into history with confidence while simultaneously reconciling personal uncertainty? The public, though largely unaware of the exact machinations behind the palace walls, was beginning to sense that something was amiss. Newspapers carried subtle hints. Unusual cancellations of royal engagements, unexplained absences, and cryptic statements designed to reassure without revealing too much. Social media buzzed with speculation, Commentators, bloggers, and journalists debated theories, each building tension for an audience hungry for insight into a monarchy on the edge. In households across the country, conversations turned quietly to the king's health, the future of the crown, and the potential for change. The nation, without realizing it, was holding its collective breath, waiting for signals that would soon arrive with undeniable clarity. Within the palace, preparations for the birthday coronation were underway, though behind the scenes they were anything but ordinary. Staff moved briskly through corridors, rehearsing ceremonial sequences, adjusting timing cues, and ensuring that every detail, from seating arrangements to ceremonial attire, was perfect. The accelerated timeline left no room for error. Even the smallest mistake could create confusion, embarrassment, or worse, public perception of instability. The pressure was compounded by the delicate balance between protocol and personal health. Charles's fragility meant that even minor exertion could have serious consequences, yet every ceremonial rehearsal, every meeting, was necessary to maintain the illusion of normalcy.